Amen. Thanks for that prayer, Brother Ted. And if you would all please open your Bibles with me this afternoon to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. I've been planning and working on a message this week that's going to be part 3 in my series of messages on the war agenda of the deep state. However, this morning, a couple hours before we had to leave the house, I realized I could not finish the message today to the point where it's ready to present today. And so it's a very important message. I think I'm going to title Nazism American Style. But because I couldn't quite get that message ready for today, I actually do have another message I've been wanting to bring anyway, titled The Light of the World, which actually keys right off of Jade's first hour lesson. That was a great segue into this message. Before we get there, though, I do want to offer some comments on the Las Vegas shooting of last Sunday night. As House Speaker Paul Ryan said, last Monday we all woke up to the news of the mass shooting at the Las Vegas country music concert. I believe the official report remains at 58 people killed, over 500 wounded. There are some voices in the alternative media suggesting that questioning if there were any deaths at all or injuries, and saying that perhaps this may have been another staged incident, such as in the Sandy Hook shooting and the Boston Marathon bombing. Paul Craig Roberts actually even suggested that as well, that possibility. However, for the record, as with the Orlando nightclub shooting, where the daughter of one of the families assembled here with us today worked as a paramedic and was on the scene as one of the first responders, and who confirms the reports of the dead and wounded in that shooting. In this case also, we do have some inside info to relate and to confirm that this was a real shooting with many dead and many more wounded. One of our listeners, I sent y'all an email this week, forwarded his prayer request. One of our listeners who lives in Las Vegas, with whom I had exchanged several emails over the past 2 years, actually, and I've also exchanged emails with his pastor as well, so I know it's a credible source. I know the guy by email. But on Monday, I had exchanged emails with him on Sunday evening about a question that he had. We've been conversing about the subject, and on Monday, I was still awaiting his response to an email when I heard the news, about the shooting, and so I sent him an email to ask him about the scene there in Las Vegas. And as it turns out, I didn't know this, but this young man, his dad works for the Las Vegas Police Department. He was on active duty Sunday night and was actually one of the first responders on the scene. And so here's this young man's first response. He says, "Last night was pure chaos. My dad works for Metro and was sent in while the shooter was still believed to be alive. He said there was panic and bodies everywhere. My cousin, I won't give her name, was a victim. Her first name is Tiffany, I'll give you that. Was a victim, shot in the stomach and shoulder. I have no official word on her condition, but last I heard she's alive and recovering. Please keep her in your church's prayers." And we did pray. I sent a prayer request out. We prayed, and she recovered rather quickly. I'm not sure if she's out of the hospital yet, but she's going to be fine. And so I immediately sent that request out to everybody on our short list of church members and loyal friends of the church. And so I sent him back an email, and I said, "I'm sending out a prayer request for Tiffany. Are the news reports accurate as to the shooter and his background?" He said they believe there was only one shooter, being as how he had different rooms and angles. It seems possible for that to be the case. Countless witnesses say there were multiple shooters, but I believe that could be due to chaos and a ridiculous amount of ammunition the shooter had. Thing they haven't discussed much of and has me very confused is reports of a woman walking around 45 minutes before the shooting telling people, "You're all going to die." Of course, we've heard that on the news as well. He confirmed that before we heard it on the news, by the way. My dad works for Metro and was one of the first responders. He said he knew who the shooter was long before the media said who it was, and that he believes there was only one shooter. Well, on Thursday, this young man sent me a picture of his cousin in her hospital room, and he wrote, "We were finally able to go visit my cousin in the hospital, and praise the Lord, she's doing well and in good spirits." He sends me the picture. He said, "This is my cousin in the hospital. I can't express how thankful I am for the prayers from everyone to see this girl smiling again." And so yesterday I wrote back to him and I said, some respected commentators are saying that the entire story of the LV shootings could be another theater hoax, as in Sandy Hook, Boston Marathon. I said, since your cousin was one of the wounded and your dad's on the police force, are you able to determine if the official numbers of casualties are in fact accurate? And his response was, "I cannot say that with any certainty. He said, I have absolutely no belief whatsoever in the official story we are being given as far as this being the work of a single 60-plus-year-old man, which neither do I. But the casualties are another story. My dad will say the numbers are accurate, and he did call us well before the news started giving official counts. He told my mom, he was on the speakerphone, so I heard it, that he was being sent to the New York casino. At the time there were news reports there may have been a second shooter there. And then he said there was about 20 dead and 50 injured at that time. We hadn't heard anything yet on the news. But don't say anything about it on Facebook or anything, he told them. At that time the news had said there were only 2 dead and 20 injured, and they had stuck with those numbers for a pretty long time. He went into more detail about his cousin. He said my cousin went into detail about seeing bodies and even some that were shot in the head. Angie Gomez was one of the first victims the news was reporting on in detail, and she is the daughter of a man who was friends with a man named Alan, who is a Christian man that attends my gym, and I talk to frequently. So this, confirms some of the news reports we're getting. He says, after seeing Tiffany in the hospital and seeing the overwhelming amount of people still there, it would be hard for me to say that 50 people dying wasn't a strong possibility, and I'm surprised there weren't more. Nonetheless, I did not see the bodies, and there are way too many discrepancies with the story. They're pushing for me to be able to believe much of it. But given that I can personally verify one of the dead victims, my dad was on the scene and says he did see dead bodies, and the number of wounded would make the number of casualties seem possible. So this was a real shooting. It really happened. It's not a fake news story. That confirms that. Whether or not this guy acted alone or if he even did the shooting at all, we were talking about that. Personally, I doubt this guy did it at all. I think that he was just a plant. He was a patsy. I think that there were two busted-out windows up there. I believe they probably had multiple shooters up there on the 32nd floor. Trained snipers, they would have had to have been, I think. But this whole thing is questionable. There are many details in the official story that make no sense whatsoever. I'm not going to go into that. That's not the purpose for this message. But actually, of course, details not making sense is to be expected in such a senseless, evil act like this. There's going to be a lot of details. None of it makes sense. So, none of it makes sense. But what is without question is that this was a very convenient catalyst for the gun grabbers to begin work, as they've done on more gun control legislation. It's also, by the way, a very convenient distraction from other news that we should have been getting that we did not get, of the Trump administration's continued escapades in the Middle East that appear really to be designed to start a disastrous shooting war with not only Iran, but also with Russia and perhaps China as well. Those escapades, by the way, include the week before this shooting, there was an alleged ISIS attack in the middle of Syria 2 weeks ago. It was led by U.S. Special Ops forces, alleged to be an ISIS attack. And this was a raid, an attack on Syrian forces, and this raid also killed 3 very high-ranking Russian officers, 1 3-star general and 2 colonels. The Russians will know that the only way the attack could have come was that it was guided by a U.S. intelligence and actually led by U.S. Special Ops advisors. And by the way, at some point, Putin is going to figure out that he can't deal with Trump. I'm sure he's already figured that out, as he hoped he'd be able to. And Putin may well say, look, we're going to have to pull the trigger ourselves. This is just not going to work. Because we've got forces now that are surrounding Russia. And it just does not look good. So Trump is basically continuing exactly what we feared Clinton would do. And so, anyway, we'll come back to that next week. One article on this attack said nominally the U.S. and Russia are both in Syria to fight the Islamic State. In other words, that's what they're supposed to be there for. The Russian troops are legitimately there, having been invited by the Syrian government. The U.S. forces have no legal justification for their presence. So far, open hostilities between the two sides have been avoided. But as the U.S. now obviously sets out to split Syria apart, openly cooperates with terrorists and does not even refrain from killing Russian officers, the gloves will have to come off. So, does not look good. I'll come back to that topic next week about the war agenda of the deep state. But for this message today, we're in Matthew chapter 5, back now to shift gears completely. We just sang that song, I Love to Tell the Story. And I want you all to ask yourself today if you love to tell the story. I mean, you sang that song, you sang the words, you sang the notes, and we go through those motions, but do you love to tell the story?